Hello, and welcome to this episode of The Life of Purpose as we look at the life of the Apostle Paul. Paul was a very complicated character, but his life, his ministry, and his writings dominate a large portion of the New Testament. And so we're spending a few weeks looking at his life, and we've talked about where he came from in Tarsus and how he was a Pharisee among Pharisees, a Hebrew among Hebrews, well educated and well gifted for that role of persecuting Christians. But then he became a Christian. He encounters Jesus on the road to Damascus and is blinded by Christ. And it's not until he fully understands that Jesus was Messiah that his eyes open again, and he sees for the first time, well, who the Messiah is and what he had been doing was wrong, and he changes his life entirely. Well, in his ministry, he spends time with the Gentiles, the people who weren't Jewish, which, as you know, majority of the world. And especially in this period of time, it was a distinct majority. And so Paul has the job of being the apostle to the Gentiles. But just like Jesus, Paul doesn't do this alone. Just like the other disciples, Paul doesn't do this alone. I mean, Jesus gathered the 12 to be with him everywhere he went, and the other apostles, they stay together at different times in their ministry, and they have others that they minister with. But Paul is the one who really shows us that we don't follow Jesus alone. And even when he describes the church, he describes it as the body of Christ made up of many members all working together to accomplish the will of Christ. And so he models that for us. And so today we're going to be talking about some of those people. We're not going to go into all of them because Paul lists a lot of people who play a significant role in his ministry. But we're going to go through some of the folks who play a bigger role, who really make an impact on Paul or with Paul.
Well, and in the early days of Paul's ministry, after he had that moment there in Damascus, he sort of has a period where we don't have a lot of information. He just said at one point, I was in Arabia, which we think is somewhere north of Damascus, not actually the Arabian Peninsula. And so he does some work. We have very little record of that.
Right.
But then the person that has been the liaison between Paul and the disciples in Jerusalem is a man by the name of Barnabas. And it's speculated that he and Barnabas may have studied together with Gamaliel. We don't know, but somehow they had a connection where Barnabas had more trust in Paul than the rest of the disciples did.
Right.
And
because the disciples had none.
They had none. This was the man who's going to kill them. And
That's
so,
right.
So Barnabas is blessed to go by the disciples back to his home area of Cyprus, and he reaches out to Paul and says, hey, you want to go with me? Mm-hmm. And they go to Cyprus, and it is phenomenally successful. And it begins a long series of journeys that he and Barnabas do together. They go throughout Asia Minor. They preach. They get thrown in jail. There's earthquakes. There's angels that open doors, and but they become really a good team.
Right.
Barnabas his name means son of encouragement. He was always that person with the disciples that sort of was the calming influence, behind the scenes. And Paul needed that because, as we learned, from the previous episodes, Paul's personality was such that there wasn't much he didn't fear. Mm-hmm. And so he needed someone to sort of guide him, say, okay, Paul, let's just not go there. Let's pull back a little bit. And so Barnabas becomes that person, and they do a number of trips together. And they bring along another person, which is Barnabas's, some say cousin or nephew. It's not clear exactly. His name is John Mark. Mm-hmm. And John Mark is the writer of the book of Mark. But he was a very young man. And Paul, at some point, John Mark, not really sure why, but I mean, after they had been beaten enough, he kind of wanted to go back to Jerusalem, seemed to be a little bit safer. And so Paul didn't want him to go on any more journeys. Mm-hmm. But Barnabas had this heart of mentoring people and bringing them along the way, and he knew that John Mark had a lot of potential. And it was kind of a sad moment when he and Paul sort of parted ways, but they blessed each other. And Paul starts traveling a little bit more with someone named Silas, and Barnabas starts traveling with John Mark. And I think it's probably the best picture of how ministry often has, what we would call Kairos time. They're perfect seasons where these two people did great things together, but then God opened new opportunities. And because they separated, the work of the church exponentiated because a lot of new other disciples came along.
Right. And there's a lot of understandings or speculation about John Mark himself. There is, in the story of Jesus' arrest in the garden, at one point it mentions that there was a young man that was there wrapped in a sheet, and he's just sort of been lurking, and when the arrest happens, he drops the sheet and runs home. That would mean he would just be running home naked, which is one of those odd moments. But many people say that that's John Mark, and they say that he's connected to the story because there is a belief system out there, or an understanding, that that John Mark's family owned the home where the upper room was housed. And so the disciples and Jesus had been in the upper room, and John Mark may have been around that. And so when they left, he had already gone to bed, but he hears them leaving to go out, and he wraps himself in his sheet and follows them, is sort of the thought. And it's also believed that where John Mark gets his information on on Jesus enough to write the very first gospel, is because that Peter, when he is arrested at one point and released, it says that he arrives back at home, and basically by virtue of his voice being recognized by the people inside, he's allowed to go in. And it's thought that it's back at the upper room, the home where the upper room was housed, back at the home of John Mark, and that Peter stays there, and that Peter is the source of much of Mark's gospel. And so there's that speculation of John Mark, but all of that would happen in that period of time after he separated from Paul. The fact he would have interacted with Peter to write the gospel, that would have been after he had separated from Paul and after he had traveled with Barnabas. And so everything does have its season. And so he for a period of time, John Mark's traveling with Paul. For a period of time, he's traveling with Barnabas. And if church tradition is right, for a period of time he's living back in Jerusalem, and he is helping to house Peter and to keep him safe, and the result is the very first gospel being written.
Yeah, and it's amazing how these characters played so much to help the furtherance of the gospel, but we know so little about them.
Right.
We're going to talk about 4 or 5 folks here, but really there are dozens that he mentions, and we don't know exactly who they are. Mm-mm. But it's apparent that Paul understood that he could not do this by himself, that he had to, if he was going to follow Christ, and if he was going to make a difference in telling more people about Christ, then he would have to start mentoring and finding other people. And so these friends were not just, passing acquaintances. These were people that were in jail with him, mm-hmm. that were sometimes beaten with him, that would go way out of the way. One couple that really shows up quite often in the New Testament is Aquila and Priscilla, or Priscilla and Aquila, depending mm-hmm. how you do it. And it's a husband and wife team, and they are both, they just support Paul. They were tent makers like he was, and so they had been run out of, I believe, Rome because of some persecution there. And when they catch up with Paul, they enter in the ministry with him.
You're right. Yes, I mean they leave after there being Emperor Claudius actually expels all of the Jews from Rome. And so Priscilla and Aquila have to flee from there, and that's when they encounter Paul. In Rome, the stress was the Jewish people in any community they lived in, if they were faithful Jews or if they were faithful Christians who had once been Jews, they're still keeping Jewish tradition. They're still separating themselves out from everyone around them. They're not living in the culture and blending into the culture. And so everything that went wrong in Rome was blamed on the Jews or blamed on the Christians because they are different. They're not worshiping at the temples. They're not worshiping idols. They're not enamored with the Roman lifestyle. And so you blamed everything on them. Nero blamed the burning of Rome on the Christians and the Jews. And so when Claudius deports all of the Jews out of Rome, he doesn't care where they go. They just can't stay there. If they stay in Rome, he'll kill them. And so Priscilla and Aquila have to flee. But aren't we? It's lucky that they did, because they go and they encounter Paul and begin a ministry with him.
And they are supportive, and they help start churches. They fully understand the gospel. And there was another person who was preaching named Apollos, and he didn't fully understand the Holy Spirit and other aspects of the gospel, and they actually sort of get him straight on all of that. And
right.
So you'll see the name Apollos occasionally. Paul said, I planted the seed and Apollos watered.
Right.
Or I
Apollos
planted. But they
one
work
plants
together.
the seed, one waters, but God gives the harvest.
That's right.
Is the gist of it. So I mean, it's everybody working together. And so Priscilla and Aquila, they travel with Paul to Syria. They travel with Paul anywhere Paul's going for a while. They are going with him, or they're going ahead of him, or following behind him, and helping to keep the gospel going.
So another person that travels a lot with Paul is someone named Silas, and he was often in jail with Paul. He went back with Paul for the Jerusalem Council. He sort of replaces Barnabas as that all the time traveling, or pretty much all the time traveling companion. But there are other times that he goes. We don't really know a whole lot more about Silas.
No.
But he was a person who was converted, and Paul found very helpful, and he told the story of Jesus to a lot of folks.
And in the song, "Give Me That Old Time Religion," he gets mentioned.
He does.
It was good for Paul and Silas. It's good enough for me.
Good enough for me. Absolutely.
There we go.
So Silas is another character that comes up a lot, and then we know of the Gospel of Luke, and we're familiar with that. It's believed that Luke wrote both the Gospel of Luke and Acts.
Right.
And at the beginning of each one, he has a preface that names himself as the author and who he's writing to. But Luke they pick him up along the way.
Yeah.
And he is, according to Paul, a physician, and he does a lot of like Aquila and Priscilla, sort of goes ahead, goes behind, takes care of things, travels with them, and provides a lot of help for them. But he then, later in life, would recall all of these trips that they had, and he would record the story of Jesus and the disciples in Luke, and then the story of the apostles post-Jesus in the book of Acts. Another person that was we find a lot in Paul's writings is he'll say, "Hey" to Timothy. And Timothy was a young man. His father was a Gentile, and his mother was Jewish, and his grandmother. And Paul really came to appreciate this family, and particularly he mentions, "Say hello to Lois, your mother, and Eunice," and he really adopts Timothy. I say adopts, but he mentors Timothy. And the books, 1st and 2nd Timothy, are kind of
he treats him as a son in the faith.
Yes.
And so because Timothy is very young, and he even instructs Timothy at one point, reminding him, "Don't let people look down on you because you're young." And because he knows that Timothy has a lot to contribute, because he has that deep faith that's been passed down from grandmother to mother to him, and he just needs to, Paul tells him to keep that faith rekindled, keep that faith, the flame of that faith high, so that he can accomplish what God's going to use him to accomplish.
Now, what's fascinating to me about Timothy is that he was Jewish, but his father was not, and he was not circumcised.
No.
And so, so Paul had this. The early church had this really strict. Either you were kind of on the Jewish side, or you were on the Gentile side. And Paul instructs Timothy, because he's Jewish, he really needs to continue with that and to be circumcised so that he could live out the Jewish side of what it means to follow Jesus Christ.
Right.
But his mother and grandmother were deeply Jewish, and so he is this person that Paul has great respect for, and helps mentor along.
And we, because his father, many times in our world, we think of the father being in charge of certain things, like oftentimes because of the way marriage is done, the woman takes the man's name, and so that you have the children all have the name of the father, and those kind of things. The understanding always has been is that Judaism passes down through the mother, and so that's why, even though he's born of a Gentile father, that's fine. But he is born of a Jewish mother, and so Judaism passes down through the mother that makes him Jewish. It's also what happens with Jesus, in that Jesus says that he is conceived by the Holy Spirit, and so we know that Joseph wasn't his father, but he's a Jew, lives as a Jew on earth because Mary's his mother. Judaism passes down through the mother, and so that's why he goes to the temple at 8 days to be presented, meaning he goes to be circumcised as part of the covenant of the covenant of Moses and into the covenant of Abraham. He's drawn back into the traditions of the Jewish faith. Timothy had not been presented; he's not been circumcised. He's not been, even though he is a Jew, he would not be allowed to function as a Jew because his Gentile father possibly has prevented that, has said no. And so Paul is saying, if you're going to be Jewish, you need to be Jewish.
So the last person that we're going to look at is a person named Onesimus, and he shows up several times, but he is especially mentioned in the New Testament book of Philemon. Mm-hmm. We're not sure exactly how it all happened, but Philemon is just one chapter, and it's this very brief book that is Paul talking to someone that he knows very deeply to take this slave back, whose name is Onesimus, which interestingly in Greek means useful. And so it's fascinating how many times he uses the word Onesimus to mean useful in the letter. But apparently Onesimus had run away from Philemon. And we're not sure if eventually Philemon released him as a slave, but he does a lot of traveling with Paul.
Right.
and helps Paul a lot.
He either gets released or he gets a day pass.
Yeah, he got a pass.
Yeah, something.
But Paul sends this letter and says, look, I know he ran away, but man, I can't tell you how helpful this guy has been to me.
Onesimus was Onesimus.
He was Onesimus. He was useful. And so it's also fascinating that in later years there is a bishop named Onesimus. Mm-hmm. And so it's believed that this young man who had been a slave eventually was able to get out of that status and became a pretty strong leader in the early church. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to look just at these few, but there were dozens more. And it's just a reminder to me that following Jesus by ourselves, it's really not possible.
No.
And particularly if we're going to grow the faith and we're going to see new disciples, we have to work together. We have to find who has Barnabas' strengths and who has Paul's strength and how those can work together for the good. But the beautiful thing is, if we don't see ourselves as alone, then we can walk the path of faith together with God and find truly a life of purpose.
Absolutely.